Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Darrel's talk on Charles Willson Peale. But before we start, will everybody please either turn off your cell phones or put them on silence so we don't have any buzzing or ringing. Thank you. Darrel.
Thank you, Kathleen. Is this too loud?
Yes.
Okay. Well, in the flyer, it says that Charles Willson Peale and Thomas Eakins are two cornerstones of art in Philadelphia, which is true, but I think of them really as in terms of the old fable about the fox and the hedgehog, because Charles Willson Peale was definitely the fox. He knew a lot of things. And Eakins was definitely the hedgehog in that he was really concentrated on one thing. Can we have the first? Okay, this is Peale at age 25, just after he had arrived in London. He was, this painting is by Benjamin West, who was another American, actually, Pennsylvania painter who arrived in London a few years before. He was born in Maryland. His father was a convicted murderer in England who had been allowed to immigrate to the United States and was an educated man and taught in public schools there, but he died at 9, and Peale was apprenticed to a saddle maker. His business didn't really succeed, and he eventually discovered a talent for painting. 11 prominent citizens in Maryland paid for his trip to England to study with West. A good local painter was a status symbol for a town in the colonies at that time, and I think that's what they wanted, because Peale was a talented painter. West was only a few years older than Peale, but his talent was discovered earlier, and his patrons had more money, so he got to England and really immediately became well known in the painting community. And American artists studied with him for really a generation of artists, because he could teach artists not only how to paint better, but also he taught them manners and self-presentation, which every painter needed. And this portrait I really like because it is painted soon after Peale got to London. You can tell that because he has a bad haircut and his suit's the wrong color. And I wondered why Peale wanted to be painted this way, why West wanted to paint him this way instead of the smooth finished product that he would become after his 3 years in London. One thing, it shows you that Peale was an artist. He's holding a pen in his hand. And it's a very interesting, it's a good portrait, I think, because it really characterizes Peale as a sort of intelligent, alert, interesting person, as he later became. He seems to be engaged with someone outside the frame. And I like to think he was talking to Benjamin Franklin, who was a friend of West's. And Peale's later autobiography recorded that they were talking about natural science. But take another look at this portrait just in terms of a portrait. And as a painter might consider painting a portrait as a problem. In that Peale has a very long, sharp nose, which is always the nose is always a problem for a portrait painter. What to do with the nose? And in this case, he's taken this sort of slightly off profile, which allows him to embed the nose in the sort of cliff side of the face. We'll see some other portraits of Peale that he painted of himself later on. And keep the nose in mind, because it's a very interesting problem that Peale solves in various ways. After a while, after 3 years, Peale returned to portrait painting in Maryland and Virginia and Philadelphia, and he was popular, but he wasn't making enough money. And then he had a stroke of luck. John Cadwallader, well, next slide, please. John Cadwallader, a Philadelphia merchant, married Elizabeth Lloyd, who was the daughter of a prosperous, wealthy Maryland plantation owner. And in fact, it was a cousin of one of her cousins that sent Peale to England. The Cadwalladers were married, but were building a house on 2nd Street in Philadelphia, and commissioned Peale to do this portrait, which is, as you see, a total of complete conspicuous consumption in colonial America. There's the gold braid on John Cadwallader's vest. There were layers of silk and lace on Elizabeth Cadwallader, and even made the baby has a kind of elaborate 2-layered skirt on. And she's sitting on a table, which is one of 2 which was commissioned by the family for their house. But it's also an interesting and has a new idea that was popular in England, in that the people in portraits were how to interact with each other. They could have emotional contact. And if you see, besides the elaborate decorations of their costumes, and don't overlook the large earring that Elizabeth Cadwallader is wearing, they're a family group, and this portrait tells a little story. I mean, she looks fondly at him. He looks fondly at the baby. The baby looks fondly at the peach. And Cadwallader also has just come in from outside. He's still carrying his coat, his hat, and his walking stick. And this idea of relationships in a portrait is something I think that appealed to Peale personally, but also was newly fashionable. And I should say that having a prominent stomach was a sign of prosperity at the time. Next slide. This is the table that Anne is sitting on. There are 2 of these, and it's part of one of the things that really distinguishes this set of furniture is it's what are called hairy feet. But beyond that one portrait, which would have been ordinary for portrait commission in the colonies at the time, John Cadwallader and his wife commissioned 4 other portraits. This is Lambert Cadwallader, also prominently stomached, as you see, in an equally elaborate dress, leaning on a chair that's not part of the set, but indicating that he belongs in the room, in a sense. And the next slide. And this is one of the chairs that were part of a set that was commissioned by the Cadwalladers for the house. Next. And this is Martha Cadwallader, Dagworthy, the John and Lambert's sister, who is dressed in a kind of costume that really wasn't a fashionable dress at the time. I wondered if she was dressed this way because they didn't want her to compete with Elizabeth Cadwallader's elaborate outfit. It's a kind of Grecian or antique robe, as they called it, which was considered to be antique, but also kind of daring in the sense that it's just a wrap robe that would open from the front, and so it it opened to all sorts of possible suggestions, but still, it was intended to suggest an antique moment. And she's leaning on a Roman altar. So the whole thing is really intended to add another layer of style to the room. And you'll see that she has a little pile of fruit on the altar. And then the next two. And then there were portraits of John's mother and father. This is John Cadwallader.
Dr. Thomas.
Thomas Cadwallader, sorry. And his wife Hannah, yes. And you can, well, no, go to the next slide. And there they are, installed in a room at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Next to, and you can see they're made as matching pairs, the mother and father, and then Lambert and Martha are wearing matching blue colors with the Cadwalladers intended to be in the middle. This is a room at the museum, but it's like what was the Cadwallader's house was, but it's not really quite the same proportion. In the original room, the two paintings of the mother and father and the brother and sister were on the walls as pairs with the family in the middle. This is actually a room from a Philadelphia house, the Peale house, which still exists in Philadelphia. Whoops, can get back to me just a bit. And the other thing that you can see about these paintings is that they have gilded frames. Originally, the gilded frames were much more elaborate and spiraled out from the frames that you see here. But in fact, as time went on and pieces broke off, the owners just filed down the edges, and that's resulting in the frames that we have today. Okay. Now, our Powell House room at the Philadelphia Museum of Art is actually from this house, the Powell House, which was built in 1765 and is very similar in a way to what the Cadwalladers built. Interestingly enough, the parlor in the museum was taken from this house, but the house wasn't torn down. And so the room in the house now is actually a replica of the room in the museum. There's a little bit of history of architectural renovation. And another room is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Well, that was one stroke of luck that Peale had. And the second one was this one. He painted the first portrait of George Washington. Martha Washington had commissioned this portrait to match one that she had from a previous marriage. It's considered really the first portrait of Washington. He was about 40 years old at this time. It's in 1772. He's a middle-aged planter who had retired from the military, but he wears a uniform in the blue and red colors of the Virginia Regiment, the unit that he commanded from 1755 to 1758 during the 7 Years' War. He was a provincial soldier, not a commissioned officer. He wears the silver gorget, which has the royal coat of arms, and he has the sash that indicates that he was the commander of his troops. You can't see it, but he has a roll of paper in his pocket that says Order of March. The setting, which again I'm kind of vague, so these slides aren't better, is in the Hudson Valley, where he actually was sent during the 7 Years' War and had some military successes. Okay, next slide, please. Well, this is Charles Wilson Peale that I think shows the real Peale. He was a radical patriot, and he decided eventually to move to Philadelphia in 1776. He had an exhibition of his work, but he also joined the Philadelphia Associators, who were a militia group founded by Benjamin Franklin. He joined as a private. When hostilities broke out, he was elected a lieutenant by his fellow soldiers, and he retired as a captain later on. And he was commanded by John Cadwalader. He was with Washington at the battles of Princeton and Trenton, and kept journals during this time. His journals of the crossing of the Delaware in 1776 and what happened during the battles are really one of the best records of a common soldier that they have, and they're really fascinating reading. Peale also was at Valley Forge, and being an artist and working to earn his living, he painted miniatures of the various officers. Did I have that? And there's his miniature of Washington. It looks kind of blue because the pinks tended to fade, leaving the miniatures looking blue. But he's painted several miniatures at this time just to make a little extra money. Next slide. And this is Washington after the battle. Peale was commissioned to paint this portrait in 1779 by the city of Philadelphia, and it was intended to commemorate Washington's battle at Princeton and Trenton, and it was sent across into Europe to stand as a sort of reminder of the American success and possibility of success in the Revolutionary War. This is not, the original one is at the Pennsylvania Academy, and this is not it. Peale painted 6 versions of this, all of which were slightly different, and also which brought him a nice income. It shows in the background soldiers and then the Princeton buildings, and the paintings are all similar. They're big. It's big, I should say. It is 93 inches tall, so it's a really handsome painting. And as I say, this one is also at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. Overall, Peale made about 60 portraits of Washington during his lifetime. But a more interesting portrait, I think, I forgot. There were prints made after this painting. Some of them kind of wonky as this one. But again, little sources of revenue for Peale and for the man who did the engraving. Peale also did some other engravings that were much better, but these were very popular. Okay. But this is, I think, the most interesting portrait that we have. It's a portrait of Washington in 1797, about 2 years before his death. One of the last portraits made of him. And Peale actually requested this sitting as a friend of Washington, who he knew well by that time. And I think it's one of the most accurate depictions, or at least we imagine it's one of the most accurate depictions of Washington. And his sitting for Peale, I think, was a sign of real friendship for Peale. It's just a simple portrait, and kind of linear in its style. But then look at this portrait. which is a portrait by Peale's son, Rembrandt Peale, painted at the same time. In fact, Peale may have asked Washington to sit because Rembrandt Peale wanted him to. What's that? Rembrandt painted Washington for about 40 years. And this is a painting made in 1851. He was the last painter to claim that he had been alive when Washington was alive. And he made about 70 of these, what were called porthole portraits. And you can see it's very much a painting of the 1850s. It's not only a very idealized portrait of Washington, but also the colors are heightened, and it's a much brighter palette than would have been popular in the 1790s. Next, please. And this is just a painting that I threw in because it's a beautiful painting. It's a painting by Rembrandt Peale of one of his brothers, Rubens Peale, who didn't have good eyesight. He's wearing glasses that they had lenses ground by Peale, and he didn't, because his eyesight was bad, he didn't become an artist. He instead ran the family museums, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But back to Washington. This is the portrait of Washington by Gilbert Stuart. This is the portrait that's on the dollar bill. And it's unfinished because he painted it not on commission, but just to make the image of Washington. The famous image that people say Washington was having trouble with his false teeth, so his face is a little swollen. And you wonder why Washington really would like this, but it was a popular image. And over Stuart's lifetime, he painted more than 100 paintings of Washington, and was always a competitor for Rembrandt Peale. Now the next. And finally, this portrait of Washington. Painters flocked to Washington to paint political figures at this time. And this is a kind of one of the most far out portraits of Washington, painted by a Swedish artist named Wertmüller. It's in the Philadelphia Museum.
What was that name?
Wertmüller, Wertmuller. And it's interesting, and it's in the museum. It was offered as a gift, and we wanted it because it shows another aspect of Washington, who, let's not say he was a vain man, but he knew he was an impressive figure. And he liked, for formal occasions, to wear his black velvet suit. And what Wertmüller shows is a little bit of the powder from Washington's hair that's fallen onto the shoulders of his velvet suit. Peale painted a lot of portraits during his career, of course, but I can't show them. And I don't want to show them all to you. After all, when you're talking about a portrait, you have to say who the person is and you have to explain who they are. But instead, I'm going to talk about Peale's many paintings of his own family. He painted really many great portraits of his family. This is going back to 1771, just after Peale got back from Europe. England, actually. And there's Peale on the left in his Londonized guise with his powdered hair and a kind of pastel-colored suit. And around him, this is a very big painting, by the way. It's about 8 feet wide. There's his brother James and his brother, Peale. Oh, this is his brother, St. George. There's his sister, Margaret. And then there's family nurse who is also a relation named Jane Gergen. In the center is Rachel Brewer, Peale's first wife, who was a big favorite of his. She's holding their daughter, Margaret, and on this side is Peale's sister, Margaret, and his mother, Margaret. Let's see. Yeah, have I gotten two names in there? I always get confused. And then there's the family dog, and Argus. Argus. And then there, of course, is the little symbol of the Peales with the peeled apple. The thing about the Peale family is that they got along well. And for generations, they wrote letters and kept diaries, which are a wonderful record of the artist life at the time. Many of them became artists. They're all in the American Philosophical Society, mostly. And it's a fascinating history of the arts in and around Philadelphia. Next slide. This is Rachel Brewer, a year later, with the daughter, Margaret, that she was holding on her lap. And it has an interesting history because it started off as a memorial portrait which just showed their daughter. Their memorial portraits were a thing that some people wanted at the time. But then, about 3 years later, Peale added the portrait of Rachel and titled it really Peale, the artist's wife, lamenting the death of her child. And it's an interesting insight into Peale's psyche, I think, that he painted this picture and then he showed it in the art show that he had when he moved to Philadelphia in 1776. John Adams saw it and said it was a very moving picture. But he also said Peale was a man who put on airs and powdered his hair and showed off in general. Next. Okay, this is a Peale portrait just a little later, showing his daughter Angelica, who was named after Angelica Kaufmann, the Swiss artist. And you can see they're all kind of oval faces and they have sharp noses. And you can see that Peale's face is very oval and his nose is more prominent. And that's a thing he will fix a little bit later in other portraits. Next, please. This is another daughter, Sophonisba Anguiscola, with his son, Charles Linnaeus. Peale, by this time, had married a second wife. His first wife, Rachel, had died in 1890. And he married a second wife, Charles Linnaeus is one of the offspring. And Peale, with his second wife, stopped naming the children after artists. Charles Linnaeus, of course, is named after the Swiss biologist who invented the naming system that Peale used to organize his natural history museum. Rachel had died in 1890, and Peale was left with 7 children, 16 and a half to 1.5 years old. And he married Elizabeth de Peyster, a woman from a wealthy family in New York. And they moved in, or they were in, the American Philosophical Society Museum, which was a big support for Peale during his career. The Philosophical Society was an institution founded by Benjamin Franklin. It was intended to promote useful knowledge, as they said. And it was many things for Peale. It was a research library. It provided him a place to live. He actually rented rooms there. And an exhibition space. Could I have the next one? This is it. It's still there, just around the corner from Independence Hall. And you can see that it's a big building. I like to think of the Peales racketing around upstairs. In all, Peale and his 2 wives had 18 children, 11 of which lived. And one more Peale family portrait. This is a portrait that he made after he'd really retired from his museum and was painting just for himself and for the museum. He always kept painting pictures for his museum. And this is called Mother Caressing Her Infant Child. And Angelica Peale, who we saw in that earlier portrait, with her daughter Charlotte. And as I said, I think Peale showed these paintings in his museum. He was always wanting new things to show, and he always showed paintings of his family in his museum. The style, as you see, is really, Peale has become a better painter in a way. Much more detailed, much firmer in the kind of treatment of paint. And I think probably really had learned from other artists who came through Philadelphia at the time. And finally, this painting, next, which you may have seen at the Philadelphia Museum. It's called The Staircase Group.
Do you want to zoom in on
Yeah, zoom in on it. It was painted really not to be just a portrait, but to be a real trompe l'oeil, to fool people if they. And Peale actually added the step below. Oops. No. No, you're going the wrong way. No, there. Okay, that's all right. Don't worry about it. These are Peale's 2 sons, Raphael and Titian Ramsey. And it's very interesting because it shows them in what some of you may know as the very steep steps of a small Philadelphia row house with its wallpaper behind. And it shows too that Raphael is going to be a painter. He said he made a whole career for himself as an artist. And Titian Ramsey, who was Peale's favorite son, who died early, at I think 18, and Peale immediately named his next son another Titian Ramsey. So there's a certain amount of confusion. But Peale intended to show this, to fool people, and there is a legend that when the painting was shown in Independence Hall, Washington was passing by and took off his hat to the 2 young men. Okay, next. Peale was a public figure and was really asked to do commissions for public events. And this is the triumphal arch that he built to celebrate the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The state issued a printed proclamation describing preparations for a demonstration of joy in each state. And Peale was commissioned to do the one for Pennsylvania. And he was commissioned to build a triumphal arch with an elaborate program of illustrations on it, including qualities such as justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude. And on the top was there a goddess of peace who actually rotated in the final version. The arch was about 50 feet tall, and it was made out of canvas and wood and painted. And it must have been an impressive sight. The declaration came in December, but then it was finished in mid-January, so it was a very fast commission. And it looked great, and people admired it very much. But on the night of the festival celebrating the event, the fireworks exploded onto the canvas of the arch and set it on fire. And Peale was up on the top adjusting the figure, and actually it fell and was burned in the process. But being Peale, he reconstructed it in front of Independence Hall, and it was re-debuted in May 10th, 1784, and it was a big success. I've been talking about Peale's museums, and now let me show you just a little bit about them. Peale opened his first museum in a gallery added to his house on Lombard Street in 1784 as an art museum to show the portraits of officers in the Revolutionary War and celebrated personages. He used a small format for most of these pictures. And then Washington and Jefferson and others encouraged him to build a natural history museum. So, being Peale, he learned taxidermy and added natural history in 1786. These are the whole series of small oval format portraits that Peale did, starting with the Second Continental Congress and moving all the way up to the opening of his museum and beyond. This is Franklin. He also painted very quickly, which was a plus in this, given his project. Can I have the next one? There's Jefferson. Again, I think a portrait that conveys something of the real man without the sort of beautification done by other artists. And let's see. And this is the second bank of the United States down in Independence, near Independence Hall, has most of Peale's collection, other than the ones that were sold and went to other museums or private individuals. And there are more than 100 paintings. It's still there. I'm not sure if it's still open, but it's still there. And you can also, while you're there, see a wood sculpture by a Philadelphia sculptor named William Rush, who will be a subject of a Thomas Eakins paintings in the next lecture. The natural history aspects of the collection was really widely varied because Peale had a lot of connections. He was in touch with naturalists and botanists in England, and Philadelphia being a shipping center, he got a lot of exotic animals from people who knew of him and brought things back literally for his collection. Let's see what he had. He had animals, fossils, minerals, mollusks, shells, reptiles, and paintings, and he even had a platypus. And these museums were really money-making operations for his family, but they also had a serious scientific interest until our first natural history museums were built. And this is Peale's really greatest triumph. The painting is called The Exhumation of the American Mastodon. And it was really a big deal because single bones of large unknown animals had been turning up really since the beginning of the 18th century. Pardon me. But, and Thomas Jefferson was really interested to have a complete skeleton. And when news of a skeleton, parts of a skeleton turned up at a farm in New York, Peale was sent up there to buy the rights to do the excavation. And they then eventually found a complete skeleton and parts of another one, which they brought back to the museum and put together and drew and filled in the extra parts with paper mache. This is the Peale family right here, with their drawing of a mastodon leg. And this is the really invention of Peale to get the water out of the excavation. It was in a very watery kind of loose stone that had to be dug out. And there is Peale's wife and one of his young children. And she, as you see, is pulling him away from the excavation. It looks a little bit irritated, maybe. It's a fascinating painting full of details. Next one. And this is one of the last paintings that Peale did, and he did it for his museum. This is a portrait of a Muslim man who Peale saw when he was in New York, painting a portrait of President James Monroe. This man's name is Mahmoud Yarrow, and he was, 83 at this time. Peale was 77. Yarrow was a Muslim, literate slave, literate in Arabic. He came to Annapolis in 1752. He was freed in 1796. But he was, Peale considered him an admirable character because he had sold money, he had saved money, he owned a house. He had great relations with his neighbors, and he was considered to be a man of good cheer and a model of industry, sobriety, and frugality, who refused to become dispirited by his history. Charles painted him because he was an interesting character. He was shown in a section of the museum in Philadelphia that was devoted to older people. And this group of older citizens and other people was devoted to them, and it said, with a sign that said, "The blessings of temperance are health, spirits, and long life." Oh yes, and this is the painting of Southport by Peale at about 1791. He was about 50, and it shows I think it's a wonderful portrait because again I think it's the real Peale, not the Londonized Peale, who by this time has had a lot of experiences and he knows a lot. And it's very hard to characterize this painting. He is obviously a smart, determined person, but maybe a little cocky. Who knows? But again, it's one of his. It's in his late style, which I think is a very revealing kind of portrait style. Next. And this is a painting by Titian Ramsey. It's just a little watercolor that shows the Peale Museum in about 1822. Peale had actually retired from the museum and left the running of it to his son Rembrandt. And they opened a second museum in Baltimore in 1814. And then their son Rubens opened a third museum in New York in 1825. And you can see what it looked like without the mastodon, which was shown in the second room. The mastodon was a real symbol, I think, of Peale's showmanship, in that in his advertisement for the painting, he said that it was shown in a separate room for an extra expense. And you could see it by candlelight, which would make it even more dramatic. So these all sound like typical ploys of today's museums. And finally, Peale was really commissioned to paint this next portrait, which is himself, in his museum. He painted it when he was 81. And you can see, I think, all the things that it had. There are the oval portraits all along the top, and some bigger ones in the back. Here are all the stuffed animal specimens. Here's the turkey in Turkey, which, as you know, Franklin wanted to be the American bird. There's, in the background, not sure if you can see this, there's a woman with her hands raised in amazement, and then other people visiting. On the ground here is the jaw of the mastodon, which actually identifies it as a mastodon because it was a member of the elephant family, but it was identified by it had spiked teeth instead of grinding teeth, which distinguished it from the other big elephant from the time period, the mammoth. And you can see Peale is himself, again, old, kind of a factual self-portrait, but also a very grand one, with him lifting the curtain to show you all the wonders of his museum. This is at the Pennsylvania Academy, if you ever want to go see it. Again, it's a really big picture. But Peale retired from his museums in 1810 and moved out to a farm. Let's see the next one. The Belfield, which is which is actually still exists. The house still exists at LaSalle University. But it was a big farm, 110 acres. He was relatively prosperous by this time. And he wanted to make it a model farm. So not just any farm, but one that had enjoyed all the latest agricultural developments and employed all the best possible farming devices. And it also was a pleasure ground, as you see. And the little gazebo was built by his son, Franklin. Peale had a long correspondence with Jefferson about farming in general. And Jefferson was very interesting because, again, I think it characterizes Peale in that Jefferson was a little condescending to him because he was, after all, a tradesman, even though as well as a knowledgeable person. But he also treated him as an equal in terms of knowledge. So it had really a very specific conversation about planting and crops and weather and all sorts of things. And the next one. And this is another painting of the cabbage crop that you can see. Peale obviously very proud. And it must have taken a lot of maintenance to keep this farm in this condition. Well, that's about all the slides I've had, but that doesn't end the list of Peale's accomplishment. He gave a series of lectures at the University of Pennsylvania on a course of natural history in 1805. He was one of the founders of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in 1812. He published an essay intended to promote domestic happiness, which he would certainly have had experience with. He experimented with the manufacture of porcelain teeth, and so you wonder if he was thinking about Washington or if he was thinking about his own teeth. He was an amateur inventor. He built an artificial arm for a member of the state legislature. He designed bridges with his sons, patented a more efficient smoke eater stove, and ground lenses for glasses, and created wax and paper mache models of human organs for the first medical school at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1814, Peale's son Rembrandt opened a second museum in Baltimore, which was the first purpose-built museum building in the U.S. Rubens opened a second museum in New York. But in 1813, the Academy of Natural Sciences was founded in Philadelphia, so the scientific aspect of Peale's museums became less important. The capital had moved from from Philadelphia to Washington. The population in Philadelphia was shifting, and the Art Center had moved to New York. So the museums closed in the 1840s, and the Philadelphia Museum, the building it was in burned in 1854, and the contents were mostly sold to P.T. Barnum, continuing the entertainment aspect of Peale's collection. So that's all I got. Any questions? Oh, yes. Libby Brown has been very helpful throughout planning this lecture. And she told me one more thing about Peale's museum that I didn't know. Libby, will you tell us? It just shows you the exotic quality of life in Philadelphia at the time.
Okay, so Peale has his museum in the upstairs of Independence Hall, and there's a man who has built a house on the 700 block of Spruce Street, who is a China merchant, and one of his, and it's the house that he later sold to Nicholas Biddle. So if you know where the Biddle house is, that's where the story took place. So one of his crew, captain of one of the ships, came back to Philadelphia from the Far East, and he had an elephant for him, and so the merchant had to put it in his backyard. A live elephant, a pygmy elephant, I think it was called, and but somehow it didn't work very well in the backyard. So the man gave it to Ricketts Circus, which is a forerunner of P.T. Barnum's Circus, which was located at 6th and Chestnut Streets. So the elephant went there, but unfortunately tried to get out, so it had to be shot and taxidermed, whatever the verb is, and put into Peale's museum.
The museum really was an assemblage of all sorts of interesting things. Franklin, just to start things off, gave Peale a white Angora, dead white Angora cat. Sweetie, you had a question? No.
And was it Peale did, was it his museum that was in Independence Hall,
Yes.
second floor?
Yeah.
Do both the Philadelphia Museum and do both the Philadelphia museums have collections of Peale?
Lots of Peales, yes. The Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts has a lot of original Peales. It has the portrait of Washington Trenton. It has the big portrait of the artist in his museum. And it has some other portraits. The Philadelphia Museum has a lot of Peales because we had a a collector who was very interested in Peales. And also, we bought the staircase group very early on in Peale's, in the museum's history. So several of the paintings we saw today were at the museum.
Any questions? Charlie?
I was struck by the fine quality of those self-portraits, but it caused me to wonder, how do you paint a self-portrait of yourself when you don't have a photography or a video?
You have to use a mirror.
Use a mirror, and then you get a reverse picture of yourself, or do you correct?
I think it's the correct picture because you're doing yourself. You're not painting. I mean, you can turn it around in your head as you're painting. Is what was I saying?
I could just add that Peale died in, what was it, 1827?
Mm-hmm.
And is buried at St. Peter's Church at 3rd and Pine Street, so, where I go. So it's he and his son, which one? I think it's Raphael, is buried there. So, and his wife Elizabeth. So.